I am delighted that you've made it your decision to be with us tonight, and I hope you've got your Bible with you. And if so, I encourage you to get that Bible and turn with us to Genesis chapter 37 is where we're going to start. Genesis chapter 37. Come back and be with us tomorrow night if you can as we bring the series to a close. We'll be talking about the wayward son comes home will be our study tomorrow night. A look at Luke 15. A story of the prodigal son and his coming back home. What brought him back home will be the question. And your study would be enhanced by having looked at that passage before tomorrow night. And so read Luke chapter 15 before our study tomorrow night. So I encourage you to turn your Bibles, if you haven't already, to Genesis chapter 37. And here in Genesis chapter 37, we are introduced to Joseph. And we're introduced to Joseph in verse 2 as a favored son of Jacob. Because of that, the brothers were envious of him, verse 11 said. They wanted to kill him, verse 18. Verse 36 said he was sold. Instead of killing him, they decided to sell him to the Midianite traders. The Midianites sold him then to Potiphar, according to verse 36, in Egypt. He brought him down to Egypt, and now he is a servant of Potiphar in Egypt. And I want us to pick up now at verse 1 of chapter 39. And that's where we're going to spend our time in Genesis chapter 39. And I want us to read verses 1 through 6. Now that he is in Potiphar's household, verses 1 to 6 tells me that he rose in power and he brought blessing to the household of Pharaoh, or of Potiphar. So beginning at verse 1, now Joseph had been taken down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, captain of the guard, an Egyptian, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had taken him down there. And the Lord was with Joseph, and he was a successful man, and he was in the house of his master the Egyptian. And his master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord made all that he did to prosper in his hand. So Joseph found favor in his sight and served him, and he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had he put in his hand. And so it was from time to time that he made him overseer of his house, and all that he had the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake, and that the blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in the house and in the field. And so he left all that he had in Joseph's hand, and he did not know what he had except for the bread which he ate, and Joseph was handsome in form and in appearance. So now he's rising in power and rising in some degree of authority in the household of Potiphar. Beginning at verse 7 now, the story is that Potiphar's wife tried to seduce him. And that's where we want to focus in our study tonight. I want us to talk tonight about the seduction of Joseph. And I want us to read now, beginning at verse 7. We won't read all the way through verse 23. We will eventually before the study is through. But I want us to read a little ways and get the story of the seduction of Joseph. And then we're going to come back and learn three things about that. So let's start now at verse 7 and see what happened now that he's in the household of Potiphar. And the focal point is that she tried to seduce him and he resisted her. More about that in a moment, beginning at verse 7. Came to pass after these things that the master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph, and she said, "Lie with me." But he refused and said to his master's wife, "Look, my master does not know what is with me in the house, and he has committed all that he has into my hand. There was no one greater than in the house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me but you, because you are his wife. How can I do this great wickedness and sin against God?" And so it was that as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. And it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, that none of the men of the house was inside, and she caught him by the garment, saying, "Lie with me." But he left his garment in her hand, and he fled, and he ran outside. And so it was that when she saw he left his garment in her hand and fled outside, that she called to the men of the house and spoke to them, saying, "See, he has brought into us a Hebrew to mock us, and he came to lie with me, and I cried out with a loud voice. And it happened that when he heard that I lifted up my voice and cried out, that he left his garment with me and fled and went outside. And so she kept the garment with her until the master came home. And she spoke with him with words like these, saying, The Hebrew servant whom you brought into us came in to me to mock me. And so it happened as I lifted up my voice and cried out that he left his garment with me and fled outside. And so it was that when the master heard these words, which his wife spoke to him, saying, Your master did to me after this manner, that his anger was aroused. Then Joseph's master took him and put him in prison, a place where the king's prisoners were confined, and he was there in prison. Now we're going to stop there, and we'll come back to the rest of that story in just a few moments. As we talk about the seduction of Joseph, I want you to focus on three things that happened in this context. The first thing I want you to notice was that she seduced him. Just a cursory reading of that text would suggest that she was doing that. Secondly, one of the most obvious things in this context was that he resisted her. And thirdly, I want you to notice there were some results that followed. And those are going to be the three things we focus on in our study tonight. And so let's begin, first of all, by talking about how the temptation was strong. Oh, it was strong. And I want to paint for you a picture tonight that this was not a mild temptation that anyone could have easily resisted. There are some temptations that may be mild, they may be minor, and it's easy to say, no, I can't do that, I won't do that, and you can resist and it's over and it's done. But not this temptation. Oh, this temptation was strong. And I want to paint for you a picture of how strong indeed that it was. It was strong when I recognized and I realized the youth that he had. When I realized how young that he was. Let's talk about his age. He had to be somewhere between 18 and 28 years of age. And you say, how do you know? Well, Genesis 37, when we're introduced to him, he was a young man of 17 years of age. And I go a little bit further, and I go over to chapter 41, and turn over to chapter 41, and look at verse 46, that Joseph was 30 years old when he was let out of prison. Remember, we left off our reading, he was just put in prison. He's 30 years old, and verse 1 says that he had been there for 2 years. So that puts him somewhere approximately between the age of about 18 to 28 years of age. And what I'm here to tell you is this, that was a time and a period when desires may have been at their greatest. Paul warned Timothy about youthful lust, 2 Timothy chapter 2 and in verse 22. There are temptations that may be peculiar to those who are old. There may be temptations that are peculiar to those in their midlife years. But there are also temptations that are peculiar to those that are in their youth. And Paul warned Timothy about that. This was a young man. Perhaps this was a period of time in his life when it would have been at its strongest in the temptation. The Apostle Paul would warn those that it's better to marry than to burn with desire, 1 Corinthians 7. And that would suggest me there's a period of time when that desire or that temptation may have been at its strongest. Oh, the temptation was strong when I realized how young he was. And here's something very practical I learned from this. And that is quite often we're ready to sell out our young people, as young people are just not interested in spiritual things. They are more immoral. But as it was with Joseph, we have young people among us that have faith and they have principle, and you have them here. There are people who have faith and they have principle. Joseph had faith, he had principle, and he's at this age somewhere between 18 and 28 years of age. But that's not the only thing that made it strong. I want to suggest to you, his temptation was strong when I recognized and realized that it was she that solicited him, not he seducing her. It is not unusual for a young man to go to a young lady and try to seduce her. But that wasn't the case here. It was a case where she was seducing him. I want you to notice with me at verse 7. The text says at verse 7, back in Genesis chapter 39, that it came to pass after these things that the master's wife cast longing eyes on Joseph. She cast longing eyes. The New American Standard translates that she looked with desire at Joseph. Another translation, the Living Bible paraphrase, said she began making eyes at Joseph. You see, Proverbs talks about do not let her allure you with her eyelids. This is talking about the immoral woman, the harlot. Proverbs 6 and in verse 25. That tells me she can say more with her eyes than she can with her tongue. Just the look of her eye and the cast of her eye, she can say more than 1,000 words would say by way of temptation. She cast longing eyes at him. She began making eyes at Joseph. Oh, the temptation was strong, wasn't it? Look at how young he was. She's the one that's making eyes at him. She's seducing him. Some suggest that it may mean that she set her eye on him. I think the former is probably the case, but some commentators think that he's focusing on the idea that she set her eye on him and he is the target of her temptation. Perhaps both are included. She set her eye on him, he's the target of her temptation, and she makes eyes at him, and she's trying to seduce him with her eyes. Oh, the temptation's strong, isn't it? But we're not through. The temptation was strong when I recognized that she told him how far she was willing to go. That she told him how far she was willing to go. Potiphar's wife is not toying and flirting only to turn out to be a tease. She's not making eyes at him and flirting with him, and then when he begins to respond in a favorable way toward her, oh no, I'm not really interested in doing that, I'm just teasing with you. That's not what's going on here. Here's what she said, look at verse 7. She said, come lie with me. Here's what I want you to do. Here's how far I'm willing to go. And I want to tell you that there were very few young men in Egypt that could have resisted that. You look at how young he was. You look at the fact that she was trying to seduce him, and not only was she flirting with him, but she says, here's what I really mean by those eyes. Here's what I'm trying to get you to do. Here's how far I'm willing to go. Oh, the temptation was strong, wasn't it? But we're not through. The temptation was strong when I recognized the repetition of her temptation. When I recognized the repetition of her temptation. I want to suggest to you that resisting at first is not too hard with any temptation. Whatever your temptation may be, the first instant of that may be something you could say, no, I'm not interested. But when it comes again and again and again, it's a little harder, isn't it? Let me give you an example of that. Do you remember Eve was tempted by Satan in the form of a serpent? And at first she resisted, didn't she? We're not supposed to eat of that fruit. God has told us not to do that. But she finally caved, didn't she? Do you remember how Samson resisted Delilah and resisted again and again? And then he finally caved to her pressure. Trying to paint for you a picture resisting at first is not all that hard. But that's not what's going on here. I want you to notice with me at verse 10. If you have your text open to verse 10, so it was that as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her or to be with her. This was not a one-time occasion. She flirted with him with her eyes, and he said, no, don't do that, and she stopped. But day after day after day after day after day, she began to flirt with him and tell him things like, come lie with me, this is what I want to do. The temptation indeed was strong. Let's look at Proverbs chapter 6, and as you're turning there, let me remind you, because we'll pay attention to this passage a little bit later, this context. In the book of Proverbs, there are 3 chapters, chapter 5, 6, and 7, that warn us about the harlot, the loose woman, the immoral woman. Great passage for us to study with our young people. Great passage for us to study with our older people. Great passage to teach our children. But I want you to notice in chapter 6 and verse 26 that from her standpoint and from Satan's standpoint, the design of this continual temptation is designed to break him down. For by means of a harlot, a man is reduced to a crust of bread, and a harlot will prey upon his precious life. From her vantage point, if she puts pressure on and puts a little more pressure on and a little more pressure on, finally it begins to erode away that resistance, and maybe he will yield, and maybe he will succumb to the temptation. The temptation indeed is strong. And I'm trying to paint for you a picture, as I mentioned a moment ago. This was not a mild temptation, easy to resist. Look at how young he was. Look at the fact she seduces him. She says, here's how far I'm willing to go. And here's the repetition of that, but here's another thing I want you to consider with me. The temptation indeed was strong because now he's presented with a convenient opportunity. With a convenient opportunity. What do we mean by that? Well, the fact is that if you could easily get caught in committing some sin, the fact that you could get caught serves as a deterrent, doesn't it? Suppose your temptation is to steal. And suppose that some money were left on this table, some cash left on this table, and you look around and there's cameras focusing on that and there's people standing around watching you. That serves as a deterrent. I don't think I'm going to go steal that. Right? I might steal somewhere, but not now. I might get caught. And the same thing is with the temptation to commit the sin of fornication. I might get caught. If someone might see, someone might know, we might get caught. That serves as a deterrent. But I want you to notice something in this context in verse 11. That here was a circumstance. She did this on more than one occasion. But on this occasion that's described here in our text, that it happened about this time when Joseph went into the house to do his work, none of the men of the house was inside. The master is gone. No other servant is around. The time is right. They're all alone. You see, being alone when no one else is around is indeed enticing. Let's go back to Proverbs. I said we'd look at Proverbs. We looked at chapter 6. Let's go to chapter 7. Warning about this harlot in Proverbs chapter 7. It describes the harlot running out to the young man in the context, and she comes out and said, I've been diligently seeking you. I've looked for you. She's lying through her teeth because she would take any man that came along. But notice at verse 18, she says, come, let us fill our love till the morning, and let us delight ourselves with love. Now notice verse 19, for my husband is not at home. But wait a minute, he may come in and catch us. No. He's not going to catch us. He went on a long journey. How do you know he won't come back? How do you know he won't come back early? Because he took a bag of money, verse 20, with him, and to say he would come home at an appointed day. He said he'd be gone for 2 weeks. Took a bag of money. He don't do that unless he's going to be gone a while. You see, he's not coming back. He's gone. We're not going to get caught. No one's around. The opportunity's just right. We have the convenient opportunity. I want to suggest to you that there is a danger of being alone when no one else is around. There's a danger of being alone in that parked car. There's danger in being alone in that apartment when no one else is around. There's a danger in being when no one else is around for long periods of time. The temptation is increased. Potiphar's wife recognized that. And I want you to consider with me the danger of that being alone when no one else is around. We're going to say more about that in a moment. There's a great danger in that. Now let's consider how strong this temptation was. How strong was it? How strong was that temptation? When you look at his youth, how young he was. And then you look at the fact she seduced him. And then you realize that she says, here's how far I'm willing to go. And then there is this repetition of it over and over and over again. And finally the time is right. No one is around. We won't get caught. No one will ever know. We can get away with this. Oh, the temptation was strong, wasn't it? But I want to suggest to you, equal to that temptation, the resistance was firm. The resistance was firm. Let's see what Joseph did in this context. And the first thing I want you to notice with me is that he resisted with words. He had somewhat to say. In fact, he had several things to say about this. Here's the first. In fact, 5 things he had to say. I want you to notice with me, first of all, he said, no, I'm not going to do that. Are you reading with me in the text? Look at verse 8. The text says, but he, notice this word, refused. In other words, he told her when she said, come lie with me, he said, no, I'm not going to do that. Look at verse 10. Look at verse 10. And so it was that as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her. Told her no. I wonder what's wrong with saying no to any sin with which we may be tempted. He said, no, I'm not going to do that. Some of you are old enough to remember back in the 80s when Ronald Reagan was in office, Nancy Reagan had a campaign as First Lady, just say no to drugs. If you remember, she was heavily criticized for that because you don't just say no to drugs. And I understand the criticism that you may have to have some help getting off of drugs. I got that. But the response to that was, what's wrong with saying no to drugs, no to any sin, no to any crime, anything that's contrary to the will of God? What's wrong with saying no to that? That's what Joseph did. He said, no, I'm not going to do it. But that's not all he said. He's not through talking. There's a second thing he said. He spoke of trust. Look at verse 8. He said, my master does not know what is with me in the house and has committed all that he has into my hand. I'm not going to betray the trust of my master. No, I'm not going to do it, number one. Number two, my master trusts me, and I'm not going to betray that trust. You see, when you're greatly tempted, remember, your parents trust you to do what's right. Your husband trusts you to do what's right. Your wife trusts you to do what is right. Someone trusts you. But he's not through talking. Notice the next thing he says at verse 9. He recalls the sacredness of marriage. He says at verse 9, there is no one greater in the house than I, nor has he kept back anything from me except for you, because you're his wife. In other words, he's saying, my master told me I could have anything, I could touch anything, I could have anything I wanted, except for you, because you're his wife. You're off limits. He spoke of the sacredness of marriage. I am not going to violate the sacredness of marriage. You're a married woman. But he's not through. Look at verse 9. He said, how can I commit this great wickedness? This is immoral. And furthermore, he said, this is a sin against God. This is a sin against God. It is not just that you're a married woman. It is not just we'd be breaking up a marriage. It's not just that we're violating the marriage vows. It's not just that someone is untrue and unfaithful, but it is a sin against our God. That's where the problem is. I don't want to minimize the impact of adultery in a marriage relationship. It's devastating to the wife or to the husband and to the children. But quite often when somebody's had an affair, our first and only focal point is, look at the damage he's done to his wife, to his children, to the family. First and foremost question should be, he sinned against his God. Joseph is looking at that. He resisted with words. What did he say? He said 5 things. We're going to review them again in a moment. But he said, no. My master trusts me. You're a married woman. This would be immoral and it's a sin against God. I can't do that. Oh, the resistance was firm, wasn't it? But he's not through. He's resisted with deeds. Not only did he resist with words and had something to say, he put his money where his mouth is, and that is he put some action to his words. He resisted with deeds. Now, there are 2 things I want you to notice about that. He refused to be with her, verse 10. Now I want you to notice a phrase that I missed for a number of years. And perhaps you've missed it as well, and if you have, let's take heed to this. Look at verse 10. So it was that as she spoke to Joseph day by day, that he did not heed her to lie with her, and here's the phrase, or to be with her. I don't know about where you were raised, but in the Bible class, we gave great emphasis as a kid that Joseph took his coat, left his coat and fled and ran outside. We're going to talk about that in a moment. But before he did that, he refused to be with her, even to be with her. What does that suggest? The New International translates that, or even to be with her. The Living Bible said he kept out of her way as much as possible. You see, he understood this principle, the danger of association, that she's tempting me. She's trying to seduce me. The more I hang around her, the more time I spend with her, the greater the temptation is. I'm going to try to avoid being around her. You see, he understood a principle that's found over in Proverbs chapter 5 and in verse 8. Do not go near the door of her house. If you're not familiar with that, remember we've been talking about Proverbs 5, 6, and 7, those 3 chapters. Run over to chapter 5 now and look at verse 8 and underline that. Do not go near the door of her house. You see, you hang around, you could easily led to temptation that could lead then to the committing of the sin. What does that suggest to you? If that lady in the same office is a temptation to you, don't go near her desk. Don't go by her office door. If that guy that works down the hall is a temptation to you, don't go down that hall. Do not go near the door of her house. Don't say, I just want to go that direction. I just want to see if they're still there. Do not go near the door of her house. Go back to verse 10. If you hadn't underlined it, you might do that. Or to be with her. He's resisting with deeds. He's trying to remove himself from the moment of temptation. But there's a second thing he did by deeds and action. And that is he fled and he ran outside. Look at verse 12. That as she grabbed his garment and said, come lie with me, he left the garment in her hand and he fled and he ran outside. Literally he did that. It's not a figurative phrase saying, well, he just kind of got away from there and he really didn't run. No, he literally ran outside. That's what he did. He removed himself from the point of temptation. His actions are showing that his words were real. I said no and I meant no. That's why I removed myself. That's why I fled and ran outside. I said no and I meant no. And I want to suggest to you that in a heated moment of temptation, you may have to leave the house. You may have to leave the car. You might have to leave that apartment. And you say, well, that's kind of funny. That's silly. You wouldn't have to do that. And if I did, I'd be made fun of. People would laugh at me that in a moment of heated passion that I just jumped out of the car and I ran to the phone for somebody to come and get me. Or I ran out of the apartment and ran somewhere and called for somebody to come and pick me up. You know what? That might be embarrassing, but that's far less embarrassing than having to acknowledge I've committed the sin of adultery. Far less embarrassing than saying I have a child out of wedlock. You may have to flee and run outside. The resistance was firm, but we're not through. He resisted not only with words, he resisted with deeds, he resisted promptly. Notice how abruptly the text says at verse 8, but he refused. And verse 12 said he fled and he ran outside. That's prompt. He resisted without the slightest hesitation. He resisted without dallying with the temptation. Let me stay around and see if she says come lie. I don't know if she means that or not. Let's see if she's willing to go that far. I'll leave before he gets too carried away. No, he doesn't do that. He resisted promptly. There was no waiting to see how far this may go. He resisted promptly. And I want to suggest to you that he also resisted firmly. There was no wavering. There was no indecision. There's no pushing aside something that he really wanted to do, secretly wanted to do. I really want to do this, but I better say no. He said no, and he meant no. Oh, the temptation was strong, wasn't it? And equal to that, the resistance was firm. How did he resist? He resisted with words. Remember the 5 things he said? He said no. He said, secondly, my master trusts me. Thirdly, you're a married woman. Fourthly, this is immoral and wickedness. And fifth, it's a sin against God. He resisted with deeds. He refused to even be around her. And then he fled and he ran outside. He resisted firmly and he resisted promptly. But I want to suggest to you that there's also some results that were clear. When Joseph fled and he ran outside and finally stopped from his running, Joseph can look back and see 3 things with greater clarity than he's ever seen before. Some of this he may have known before, may have seen before, but now he can see with greater clarity than he's ever seen before. Like what? Well, first of all, I want to suggest to you that he can see a difference between love and lust. Joseph may well understood that before. I have no doubt that he did, but not with the clarity he does now. This woman lusted after him, but she did not love him. You say, what evidence do you have? Well, let's go to our text. Look at the lies she told. Look at the lies that she told in her effort to destroy him. The same man that she's going over here begging and pleading, saying, come lie with me. When he fled and he ran outside, when she saw that he had left the garment in her hand, I'm reading at verse 13, she called the men of the house and spoke to them this way, saying, see how this Hebrew came in to mock us, to come and lie with me. And I cried out with a loud voice. You know what she's saying? This man who owns this garment tried to rape me. And if I hadn't have been vocal and cried out with a loud voice, he'd have got away with it. But thankful I cried out, and he ran away. This is the garment of the man. The man who owns this garment is the man who tried to rape me. And so notice what she says at verse 15. She said, I lifted up my voice and I cried out, and he fled and he ran outside. She kept the garment so that when her master comes home, her husband Potiphar comes home, she said, and see how she puts the blame on him, that Hebrew that you brought into us. It's really your fault. If you hadn't brought him, this wouldn't have happened. You see, he was the one trying to mock me. He tried to rape me, and I have this garment. He fled and he ran outside, but I cried out with a loud voice, thankfully. And she's lying through her teeth about what happened. She set out to let him go to prison, trying to destroy him. She didn't care about him at all. She was lusting after him. Pulpit said, but indeed all illicit passion, whether gratified or balked, has a tendency sooner or later to become transformed into hate. I say amen. And I'm here tonight to tell you that one who lusts after you does not necessarily love you. You see, lust seeks gratification. Love cares about the person. When that young man in a heated moment of passion saying, if you love me, you will. Don't buy into the concept that he loves you, or that your favorable response to him is equal to love. There is a difference between love and lust. You think Joseph saw that before? I think he probably did. But once he gets on the outside and he settles down and he gets through running, he can look back and he can see with greater clarity, you know what? That woman lusted after me, but she did not love me. Something else he can look back and see. Not only does he see the difference in love and lust, he can see what he lost. He ran out so fast he left some things inside. He no doubt thought about some things he left inside. One of the most obvious is his garment or his coat. He left it in her hand. I don't know what it was worth, what its value was, but he's left it. It's gone. But that's not all he left inside. There's something else he left inside. He left his job inside. He had quite a prestigious job. He was basically second in command to Potiphar. All that Potiphar had was in his hand. He controlled everything for Potiphar. I know he lost his job because we left off with the reading he'd been put in prison. He ain't working for him no more. When the dust finally settles on his journey outside, he has to look back and say, I just lost my job. But that's not all he left inside. He left his freedom inside. He was a free man prior to this. He's now in jail. He's in prison. Spends 2 years there for something he didn't do, based on lies. And Joseph has to look back now and say, I just lost my freedom. I lost my job, I lost my coat, I lost my freedom. Tell you something else he lost. He left inside. His standing and his approval of men. See, the men of the house that she called over and said, look at this garment, this man that owns this garment tried to rape me. Text doesn't tell us. I don't know if they believed her or not. But she's trying to destroy his reputation among men. Potiphar, I don't know if he believed him or not, but he responded as if he did. To say the least, anyone who didn't know about that and want to know what happened to that man that was second in command, Potiphar, well, he's been put in prison. Why? Well, his wife accused him of rape. He's in prison. And I want to tell you, young person, you may lose your boyfriend when you say no. You may lose your girlfriend when you say no. You may lose your standing among your friends. They may ridicule you because you don't do what everybody else is doing this, but you're not. And you may lose your standing. You may run and flee outside, and you may stand out there in the dust and you say, look back and say, you know what, I've lost some things. I lost a boyfriend, lost a girlfriend. I lost my friends. I said there are three things. Joseph could get outside and he could see three things with greater clarity. He could see the difference in love and lust. He can see some things he left behind. But I want to tell you, he brought some things out with him. We don't talk much about that. There's some things he kept. Things that are important to us we want to take with us when we flee. I don't know about you, but I've often thought, if there's a fire and an emergency, what am I going to grab first? There's certain things I want to grab. My Bible is one of them. Not just because it's a Bible. I've got too many notes. It can't go. It's got to stay with me. But he took some things with him. What did he bring out with him? He brought his purity out, didn't he? Didn't he say no? And didn't he refuse, verse 8? And didn't he flee and run outside? See, he could have left his purity inside and lost it. When the dust settles down and he finally quits running and he can look back and say, you know what, I brought my purity out. I'm still a pure man. That's not all he brought out with him. He brought his honor. Proverbs 6 warns about the man who gets in contact with the harlot and succumbs to her temptation. Wounds and dishonor will he get. Not Joseph. He brought his honor out with him. He had time to bring it with him. Tell you what else he brought out with him, his conscience. Joseph has a clear conscience now. Joseph doesn't get out on the outside and say, you know what, oh, what was I thinking? What did I do? I yielded to the temptation and I know it was wrong. How can I face my family now? Joseph's conscience not bothering him. He brought his clear conscience with him. Tell you what else he kept? His reputation among the godly. Evidence, you ask? We're talking about him tonight, aren't we? And this isn't the first sermon you've ever heard on Joseph. You see, godly people talk about Joseph all the time. He kept that reputation among the godly, didn't he? And he kept his relationship with his God. I said we'd finish Genesis 39, so let's go back there. He kept his reputation with his God. We left off in our reading that he was left in prison. Verse 21. But the Lord was with Joseph and showed him mercy, and he gave him favor in the sight of the keeper of the prison. And the keeper of the prison committed to Joseph's hand all the prisoners who were in the prison, and whatever they did there, it was his doing. And the keeper of the prison did not look into anything that was under Joseph's hands, because the Lord was with him, and whatever he did, the Lord made it prosper. See, he kept his relationship with his God. See, what he brought out with him was worth a whole lot more than what he left behind. I don't know what that garment was worth, but doesn't compare with what he brought out. Maybe a prestigious job, but it doesn't compare to his conscience, his purity, his relationship with his God. His reputation among men doesn't begin to compare to his reputation with his God. See, Joseph got on the outside and he can look back with greater clarity than he ever before saw. You know what? I see the difference in love and lust now. I saw some things I left behind. That's fine. But look what I brought out with me. The seduction of Joseph. The temptation was strong. Oh, it was strong, wasn't it? The resistance was firm, and the results were clear. Nearly everywhere I go, unless I've been asked to speak on some other subject, I try to deal with either this or something similar to this. Why? There was a survey made a number of years ago among colleges across the nation, and I don't remember the numbers, but the question was the percentage of college-age students that committed the sin of premarital sexual relations. Whatever the numbers were, it was significantly high. So some of the, and I put in quotations, brethren who operated schools, which not only include I don't know that it included Florida College, but it included the colleges that operated among some of the churches of Christ, like David Lipscomb and Harding and Freed Hardeman and Oklahoma Christian, etc., all those colleges. And they found the number of those who committed the sin of fornication significantly lower than the national average in college. So the question was then, why? Why do you not commit the sin of fornication? And there were varied reasons that were given in the survey. Some said their parents had instructed. Others said Bible class teachers really impressed them. And others said we were just taught this in the home and drilled in our heads in the homes. Others were afraid of pregnancy. Others were afraid of venereal disease. Various reasons given. Number one answer. Pulpit preaching and teaching on the subject. Amazing. And so my goal here tonight is, there may be some person present that 10 years from now, in a moment of temptation, remembers this story, this lesson. They don't remember whether that was that Brother Rader or Brother Lee or Brother one of those guys. Somebody, I don't know who it was that preached it. It doesn't matter. They remember the principle, and we spare one life. This has been a successful gospel meeting if we do that one thing. And that's why you hear this study tonight. There may be one or more present who's not a Christian, who's not a child of God. Would you come tonight believing that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God? Would you repent of your sins, acknowledge your faith, and be buried in the waters of baptism for the remission of sins? If you're subject in any way, would you come while together we stand and while we sing?